Hey, everybody, welcome to this episode of Mismatch. So, we've all had that person, the one who seems so charming at first, confident, magnetic, maybe even a little bit intense, and then slowly something starts to feel off. They perhaps manipulate, they lie, they twist things, somehow you're the one that's questioning yourself. Like, am I crazy? Did I do something wrong? Today's guest, Leanne Ten Brinke, is a psychology researcher who studies what she calls poisonous people. Now, not villains in movies, but the ones we actually encounter in real life. Perhaps your boss, your friend, or even your partner. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The people who cause the most damage in our lives don't always look dangerous. They actually, in fact, look more desirable. And this conversation is all about how to spot them, why we're drawn to them, and how to protect ourselves from them. Leanne, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so tell me, when you say poisonous people, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so when I use that phrase, I'm referring to people who score relatively highly on this constellation of what psychologists call the dark tetrad of traits. So 4 traits, they're psychopathy, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sadism. And they all overlap to some extent. So if you think about them like a Venn diagram and there's overlap between all of these circles, they all overlap at callousness, manipulation, and kind of antagonism, like they're working against you. They're hostile to other people as opposed to like working with people. But each of those traits also has this kind of like unique flavor as well. So psychopathy is associated with impulsivity, whereas Machiavellianism is kind of the opposite. It's very strategic. And usually they're telling lies in pursuit of power in particular. Narcissism, we probably all know pretty well, associated with grandiosity and, entitlement, whereas sadism is associated with taking pleasure in other people's pain. And I think that, equating this with a kind of poison makes sense because there's often someone on the other side of those callous and manipulative acts. And so someone is being harmed by these behaviors. And more than that, it tends to spread. So like when we're around these people, sometimes we can start to adopt similar behaviors. And so you can get that kind of rot spreading throughout like an organization, for example.
Which is why I've used this expression and I've encountered it, honestly. It very much matters top down how an organization, and even in any sort of partnership, really, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're hugely affected by the people around us, and we tend to pay even more attention to the people who are in powerful positions. Like we literally look at them more in groups than people who are relatively powerless. And so their behavior tends to have a huge impact on the people around them.
So I guess in saying this, is this something that is more common than we perhaps realize?
Yeah, so all of these traits exist on a continuum, meaning like everyone scores somewhere from very low to very high on all of these traits. And so
Okay.
when you're talking about clinical levels of these traits, like narcissistic personality disorder or someone who has clinical levels of psychopathy, that's a very small portion. Our best estimates are about 1% of the population has clinical levels of psychopathy, a little bit more for narcissistic personality, like 2 to 5%. But you don't have to have like clinical levels of these traits for you to cause harm, right? And so, the trouble is, the kind of problem is that because it's a continuum, it's very hard to identify what that cut point is. Like at what point do we consider someone causing harm? And researchers have tried to do this in a variety of different ways. Like, do you seem to have more like dark traits than light traits? Do you tend to agree with all the items that we use to measure dark traits? And if you tend to agree with all of those things, like, I am better than other people, or the feelings of other people don't affect me, then you can say, okay, they seem to have these traits. But you're right that it's like if we only think about those people that have clinical levels of these traits, we kind of miss all of the lower level but still harmful behaviors of the other people in our midst.
So, like, of that kind of group of people that, again, are kind of the middle ground, so to speak, or are on like a lesser form of that spectrum, let's say, why are we attracted to people like this? Like, to some degree, we do this to ourselves, but like, what are people missing to identify this sort of thing?
I think there's a couple of things going on. One is that, with narcissism in particular, they come across incredibly confident, and we are like drawn to confidence. And we also mistake confidence for competence. And so we tend to believe people, whenever they say like, I'm a great leader or I'm so good at this task, we tend to believe them. And so we mistake, what they say they can do for what they can actually do. So that's one thing. A related thing is that we're really bad at detecting lies. And so we know that people with these personality traits are very willing to lie to us. They tend to tell, on average, more lies than people with fewer of these traits. And honestly, we're kind of like sitting ducks when it comes to deception. So people tend to think like, oh, I'm a pretty good lie detector. But if you actually give people a task where it's like, here's a bunch of videos of people lying and telling the truth, and can you discriminate who's who? They're very bad at it. It's basically like 50% accuracy. People are flipping a coin. And if you don't alert people, if you don't tell people, oh, some folks are lying and some are telling the truth, the idea that someone's lying to us almost never occurs to us. So we just like accept the information we receive as truth. And so because they lie a lot, they tend to get away with it a lot as well.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. What are going on with this? Like, what are some first impressions that people can like look for, or maybe even particular like line of questioning to kind of be able to identify or weed out these people?
So I think there's a few things that you can do. You can look for kind of behavioral red flags. So we do know that people with more of these dark traits tend to behave in certain ways. And so none of these things are like a Pinocchio's nose. None of them are like, oh, if you see someone do this once, then they necessarily have high levels of these traits. But we do know that people who engage in these behaviors more often tend to have higher levels. So let me give you some examples. One is like they interrupt you all the time, but refuse to be interrupted themselves. They ignore boundaries. So like maybe you're at work and you say something like, oh, I don't like to talk about my family at work, but they keep asking you about your home life, right? So they know the boundary exists, but they keep pushing on it. They also tend to have a distinct or different emotional experience, particularly when it comes to psychopathy. So they may seem really calm and like unaffected by stressful situations. And they may engage in kind of like ambivalent emotional expressions. Things like we found in one study that they would say like really angry or hostile things at the same time as they were smiling broadly. So this kind of like disconnect in their expression. Narcissism is things like talking about themselves a lot, right? And sadism might include things like laughing when other people are in pain or fail in some way. And so, of course, none of these things are like, we've all done these things sometimes. Like people talk about themselves quite a bit, but people with high levels of narcissism talk about themselves even more. So you want to look for a pattern over time.
Okay.
And when it comes to, kind of getting first impressions, and particularly if you're in a situation where this person wants to get something from you, maybe it's as simple as like they want to make a good first impression on a first date or something like that. You might want to look at things like how they treat people that are not you, right? So like, how are they treating the Uber driver? How are they treating the hostess at the restaurant? Especially if they get told like, oh, your reservation is going to be delayed or something. Like if they get told no, especially by someone that they are not concerned about making a good first impression toward, you might start to see kind of cracks in the facade, because you're right that people with these traits can be very charming initially, and they can tell lies, especially when there's something on the line for them. So, looking at how they treat other people is also a useful indicator.
You said love and dating. Let's talk about these people in that scenario, because that's a whole other layer. And I have found, I don't know what it is, Leanne. For me, it's like the 2.5, 3 year mark is when the crazy reveals the crazy. It's like this, I don't know what it is about that timeline, but it's like all of these traits start becoming very apparent. Maybe is it, and so is it a me thing that I'm ignoring it, or is it just that all these things start adding up and it finally makes sense?
That's a good question. I mean, people's personality should start to, become clearer over time. So certainly, you start to get a better sense of a person the more data you have about them.
Right.
Now, hopefully you start to see some of those traits before like 2 or 3 years in, but it's totally possible that you could like justify or, not see that those traits are particularly a problem. So, with narcissism in particular, that can look really attractive at first. Like a very confident person is a pretty attractive person. But over time, you start to see that, you are not a priority for them, because their biggest priority is themselves. And so perhaps it's like at that timeline where you're like, okay, we should be moving forward, together. And it starts to become clear that that's not going to work. And so particularly with narcissism, we've got pretty good data that this can look really good. Those relationships, kind of flourish at the start, and then there becomes a whole lot of conflict later on.
Yes, that is accurate for sure. Is there, would you say, like a personality type that's more vulnerable to these kinds of people?
That's a good question. I certainly wouldn't want to, blame anyone who gets kind of wrapped up in the webs of these individuals. But we do know that people with these traits, a lot of this research has been done with people with psychopathic personality traits. Like they do tend to gravitate towards certain people who seem to be like relatively easy for them to control, and they have some sort of resource that they want. That could be money, it could be sex, it could be whatever. And so people who have experienced victimization in the past, we do find that people with high levels of psychopathy tend to gravitate toward those individuals. And perhaps it's kind of like a general sense of vulnerability that they are looking for. And I think also, again, important to note that it's not anything that person is, doing that is reeling these people in, but they're looking for essentially a relatively easy mark. And that might be something that they're looking for.
For sure. So then I guess my question is, are these people fixable?
Great question. So there's been, I think people have the assumption that personality is set, especially when we get older and there's no change in someone. That's not entirely true. So research does suggest that our personality can change, albeit pretty slowly over time. And even people with these traits can improve over time. Now, most of the research we have on treatment with individuals with psychopathic traits in particular is in the criminal context. So there, we've got what you might say is a relatively low bar for improvement. So like we do find that people who, when they're in prison, engage in treatment and stick with treatment are less likely to reoffend once they get released back into the community. So that is great news. Yeah, absolutely. It does require commitment and like sticking to it, right? So, and it is more of a harm reduction as opposed to like their personality didn't completely change. They're just like not offending violently as much anymore. So, I think if you know someone with these traits, there is room for improvement, but it really requires their motivation to change. And that is not equal to your motivation to change. Like, you might really want them to change, to improve, but that's not as important as their motivation to change. And that tends to be pretty lacking in people with these traits.
Which leads then people to believe that people are not capable of changing because of the lack thereof.
Yeah, so there was this other study where they asked people who knew someone with these traits, over the course of their life, did they improve like past the age of 50 or not? And like 90-some% of people said they were the same or worse after the age of 50 as they were beforehand. So that's one of the things that, I think is useful for people to know if they're in a relationship with someone with these traits, like having a clear-eyed view of like the likelihood of that change, particularly if they're not motivated to pursue treatment and to change on their own. Because if you're sticking around just kind of like hoping that time will make it better, that's probably a pretty unlikely scenario.
Yeah, that's really good advice, I think, in many areas of life. If you're dealing with someone, of the four categories, again, in the higher end of the spectrum, how would you suggest to like protect yourself against people like that, or like remove yourself or create the boundary, things like that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to think about, whether to stay or go. And that's not a decision that I or anyone else can make for you. What I do hope that people consider is like that they have that kind of clear-eyed view of what is likely to change, what is not, that we just talked about, and also that they consider whether it's sunk costs that are keeping them in that relationship or not. So sunk costs are just things like, you reason that you put so much time and energy and effort into this relationship already that it would be a waste to leave now. But those past, expenditures are not a good reason to, keep digging that hole in the future.
Right.
But this can be incredibly difficult. And one good way to try to dig yourself out of that sunk cost hole is to think about the cost of staying in this relationship on other people. So you might be very willing to like burden the weight of continuing in this relationship, but you might also think about like, okay, if I stay, what is the impact on, my kids, other people in my family? Or, if you stay in that job with a bad boss, what is the impact of you coming home really stressed out and angry all the time on your family? And you might not be willing to, put that burden on the people around you. And so that can be one helpful way to think about, getting around that sunk cost fallacy that often keeps us trapped in relationships. So, you can decide to leave. If you do decide to leave, please do it safely. So we do know that people with these traits can be incredibly dangerous to leave domestic situations, especially where there's been violence in the past. So, reaching out to someone you trust, making a plan, working with domestic violence organizations in the community can really help you. Leaving when they're not around, and then changing your schedule afterwards are some things you can do to avoid a really devastating outcome in that case. If you do decide to stick around, you're not you're not powerless either. And so there are things that you can do to try to mitigate the harm of your interactions. Now, here you're not trying to like change someone's personality. It's more like, how can you get through, say, family dinner with a little less drama?
Right.
And so, like you mentioned, boundaries are useful, and making them explicit is really helpful. Now, it's not a guarantee that they're actually going to follow that boundary, but we do know from research that people with these traits are more likely to follow explicit rules than the ones that are just kind of like social norms that are left unsaid that we assume everyone knows. Like, I spoke to this one person who had clinical levels of psychopathy, and her strategy moving through life was like to only follow the rules that were written down, because those are the only ones that could be like used against her. Otherwise, it's like, you know, what are you gonna say? There's no written rule about this. So
Right.
kind of like writing it down, figuring out what your red lines are, writing it down, letting them know is a start in any case. Then there's other little things, kind of like creating tiny common ground. If you know that you're going to have to give someone kind of negative feedback, maybe like they're not upholding their family duties, or, you know, at work, your team member is not, you know, doing the work in the way that you had hoped that they would, you can start that conversation by like creating this little bit of loyalty. So people with these traits don't care that much about like fairness or like not harming you, but they do care about loyalty. So you can just do little things like reminding them that you went to the same, I don't know, same school, or that you root for the same team. Creating some little touch point makes you part of their like in group, and it makes them less likely to blow up whenever you give them negative feedback later. What I would not recommend doing is trying to fight fire with fire. And this is what I often hear people doing, like, they lied to me, so I'm going to lie about them. Or like, you know, they're really callous toward me, so like, I don't care about them at all. And I think that it makes us feel icky. Like we don't want to be that way. And I also think it can be pretty detrimental. Like if you just rely on punishment, you're not actually rewarding them for doing good. You are ignoring this whole really useful tool for shaping their behavior in the future.
If anything, you're encouraging the bad behavior.
Yeah, so what's fascinating, particularly about psychopathy, is that punishment literally doesn't hit them as hard. Like their brains do not they don't process punishment in the same way as people with low levels of these traits. So they don't have that same kind of fear. The next time they, you know, have the opportunity to do the same thing again, their brain doesn't do that thing like, oh no, don't do it. Like that just doesn't happen for people with these traits. And so if you only use punishment, first of all, it doesn't work. And if you never reward them for doing something good, because you're like, they're a bad person, they don't deserve reward. If you don't reward them for doing something good, then you don't get to capitalize on what they actually care about, which is rewards. They're very reward sensitive. And so if you can, you know, give them praise, or encouragement, or, you know, at work, like a raise or a fancy new job title for doing really well, you'll get more of that behavior over.
That's so interesting. It's like counterintuitive to what you would want to do. It's like do the opposite.
Yeah.
What was the most like staggering maybe stat or percentage or kind of knowledge gained through this research?
I think the most staggering part is the incredible cost of just a handful of people with these traits. So like I think it's clearest in our research on criminal behavior. So researchers added up all of the costs that would not exist if all of the laws were just followed. So like, you know, we wouldn't have to have the criminal justice system. We wouldn't need to have, you know, people in prison. We wouldn't need prison guards, etc. We also wouldn't need like security cameras and all these other things. We wouldn't have lost time at work. And the amount in the US annually is ginormous. It's like $5 billion, which is estimated the cost of crime per year. And people with psychopathy, clinical levels of psychopathy, so that very extreme end, they account for about 20% of the incarcerated population, but they commit 50% of the serious crime. So you could pin like $2.5 billion a year on just people with clinical levels of psychopathy. And so it's just like, it's wild how a real minority of people have this huge impact on our lives. And that's just in the criminal context, right? Let alone, the stress and the pain that they cause kind of everyone in their orbit. And so there's that stat, which I think is wild, but then there's also this much more like optimistic stat, which is that if you intervene early, every dollar spent on providing treatment for youth with these traits provides you with a $7 return in terms of cost savings in criminal justice fees later. There's also the flip side, and I really hope that people, see some of the optimism here too. This is a big problem, but it's a few people, and we can do things to at least mitigate the harm, which can have a gigantic benefit for everyone.
And the sooner that you kind of like take notice to that, or as you said, like provide treatment, I mean, the more likelihood then there is for like improvement or rehabilitation, quote unquote, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the like silver lining in this like pretty dark literature is that if you intervene early with kids who have callous and unemotional traits, you can see some of these traits popping up as young as like 2 or 3 years old in some cases. But if you intervene then, if you provide treatment for these kids, again, it's not a quick fix, but you can actually see, empathy and compassion improving in these kids. And so if we would, intervene early and not just label these kids as like they're troubled kids. And again, we just want to punish them and we never want to reward them, even if they do something good, then we are just like creating these incredible costs that we're going to incur down.
Which is what we don't want. We need to take care of our youth. For sure. And in this research, and again, these discoveries that you've made and identified, what comes to mind in your life that was the biggest like aha understanding moment?
Good question. Honestly, I feel like it's just been a long, long journey of learning. But what I think, okay, here it is. One thing that I did was I started studying these traits in the criminal context. So I was studying forensic psychology. I was looking at criminal reoffense patterns in sexual offenders. That's what I was doing in my like undergrad. And I was looking at murderers in my PhD thesis. And I got really bummed out. And I was like, there must be, some.
That's heavy stuff, Leanne.
It totally is. And I honestly was like, there must be a silver lining. There must be like some place where these traits can thrive. And so I went to a business school and I started studying these traits in like business students as well as US senators and hedge fund managers. Cause I was like, there must be some place where like they can, contribute. And what I found was just the same patterns like over and over again. But I think that was actually what was really interesting and insightful is that I think we expect that in leadership or like in these really competitive finance or governmental positions that these people can do something for us that people without these traits cannot. And I've actually found the opposite, that they tend to make less money. They get less co-sponsors on their bills. They're more likely to contribute to stagnation in government than to actual, progress. And so I think that's what I've learned is that there's these consistencies across contexts that we probably shouldn't expect there to be, something different from business to politics to criminal justice to our families, to our friend groups, et cetera.
That's so interesting because I think the assumption often is that you need to be a particular personality to be in certain roles of, say, leadership or whatever it be, to have that sort of power like position. And it's like, no, you don't need to be a lunatic asshole to get people to listen to you or respect you.
Yeah, exactly. So like there's this whole other body of research in psychology, which I love and have done a little work in myself, where it's like there's different ways of gaining power. You can dominate people, which is what people with these personality traits tend to do. They dominate others into submission. But that's like good for them, but like shitty for everyone else, right?
Exactly.
Whereas other ways that you can gain power and influence over other people is to be admired for, maybe a special skill that you have to be respected for, the moral clarity that you bring to a situation. And those are like more durable forms, I think, of power that benefit way more than just the individual at the top. And so, especially when we feel scared, when the world feels like this competition around us, when there's economic inequality, when there's like military conflict going on, we tend to be gravitating toward these domineering leaders. And I think what we need is like precisely the opposite of that.
You just solved the world's biggest problems, Leanne.
No, anytime.
Thank you so much for your time. Again, Poisonous People is out. Where can people find your book and follow you and keep up with more research that you're doing?
Yeah, you can check out the book. It's on Amazon or at your local bookseller. I'm on socials at Leanne Ten Brinke, LeanneTenBrinke. And yeah, come give a follow. Love to see you there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and wisdom.
You're so welcome. Thanks for chat.